Hey there, welcome to Serious Jibber-Jabber. I'm Conan O'Brien. Mark Lewisohn is widely recognized as the world's foremost authority on the Beatles. His books, which have chronicled in great detail the band's activities on stage, in the studio, and everywhere in between, are considered indispensable by Beatle fans and music historians. His latest project is an extraordinary three-part biography of the band, the first volume of which is entitled Tune In. And it is fantastic. Mark Lewisohn, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure, thank you.
All right. We should start with my belief when this book came out that there's no way I could read anything about the Beatles that I didn't know. Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge Beatles fan, and I have friends that I can talk with for hours on end about the Beatles and really get into the minutia, and I thought I knew everything. Your book comes along, and I realized I knew nothing, and I was blown away by it. It's a real achievement.
Thank you, thank you. It's the first of three, and the reason I'm writing it is because I knew that in biographical terms, in history terms, the Beatles story had never really been told properly, at least not what I consider properly, which is real with depth and with authority and with painstaking attention to detail and accuracy based on real research. And it's surprising what you find, because most of the books that you have read on which you based your knowledge, in terms of biography, they skim the surface. You know, the writers will take a year or two. And in that time, they'll maybe do 6-9 months of research, 6-9 months of interviews, and then they'll write. And I felt always this was a subject that would merit much deeper research than that. And it's shown, because I found so many people who have never been in a book before who tell completely new and different stories.
Right.
And in particular, the documents tell a radically different story.
Here's the, you know, the Beatles, when I go to the bookstore and you see there's certain sections, JFK assassination, there'll be 800 books. The Beatles, there'll be many books. But, and so one can think, I know this subject. We've seen it all and we've heard it all. And one of the problems that I encountered, and I saw it a little bit in the Beatles anthology, is that there are a lot of anecdotes you can tell that the band has told a million times.
Yes.
And I started to realize at some point that the Beatles, the surviving Beatles, may at this point be the worst authority on what the Beatles were all about, because they have talked about it so much. It's almost biology. They've worn neural grooves, and they have stories that they want to be true or ways they want to see it. I sometimes think Paul is too, you know, well, we were just a band that made it big, and you know, and that was what it was. We weren't really that. We were just a bunch of lads. And you
didn't know they were Irish.
Yeah, they were. That's my. If you heard my Irish accent, you'd be really horrified. But they almost became the worst authorities on things Beatles because they've talked about it so much, and their perspective is a little skewed. I know you had an interaction with George Harrison once when he confronted you and said, "How can you write about us?" Isn't that right?
Yeah, he said, "How can you write about us because you weren't there?" And I see his point completely, because I wasn't there. But on the other hand, how many books will be written if only the direct observers or witnesses to something were actually writing it? So I take what he said on board. I wasn't there, and at no point do I claim that I was there. But you can find people who were there. I mean, they talk about the pure essence of the Beatles is the four of them together. And very often it was just the four of them, maybe their friend Neil, who was their assistant, maybe a driver. But actually, really, in the back of the car, it was 4, maybe 5. But sometimes there were other people. There's a wonderful anecdote in the book told by a guy called Bernie Boyle, who was a young kid in Liverpool that the Beatles kind of allowed to go around with them. You know, I'll carry a guitar in and get in for nothing kind of thing. Because they were playing dates every night of the week, playing gigs, but they weren't really gigs, they were dances, really. And Bernie was in the van when they went and did a big gig in the south of England. He was with them all day long in the van, and he told me of the banter in the van and how John was winding Paul up the whole way. And just that immediacy of that anecdote means that other people were present, and you can get inside even the most private of places because they were so accepting of other people being around them. Obviously, because they've told their stories so many times, certain elements of it, certain stories will be told too many times. I know some people who used to look at Paul McCartney interviews and say, he's told story 103, 89, and 602B, because you could actually name which ones he was going to say.
It's a jukebox.
He said
someone pushes the button, and then this story comes out.
But is it their problem? Is it their fault that they get asked the same questions all the time? I mean, I interview Paul a lot, and I always asked him, dare I say it, good questions, informed questions, and he responded perfectly.
Yeah.
So I think actually if they were asked better questions, we would have more from them. But they've been interviewed more times than anybody I could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And part of my job for this research is to find every interview they've ever given in any medium at any time to anyone. And the material, if you look at it all in total, is extraordinary. They have said so much. They have been very revealing in their interviews.
What I would say I'm going to say my favorite aspect of this book is that it does not treat the Beatles as an inevitability. It does not treat the Beatles as this is the story of the famous Beatles who we all know had to be. You are approaching it like a true historian, and you are taking it a day at a time. And what's clear when you read the book, and it's really stunning and counterintuitive for a lot of people, is that the Beatles almost didn't happen a million different ways.
Yes.
It almost went off the rails so many times, and I'm talking way before, the Beatlemania in '63 in London, or the Sullivan in '64 in America. There are so many times when this maybe even shouldn't have happened, that's what makes the story so miraculous.
The story is miraculous. There are, as you say, there are so many moments when it could come unstuck, and in order for it to happen, there are incredible amount of occurrences of good fortune, and you would think, well, that's unlikely. But the sheer number of them makes you realise that actually this was kind of meant to be. I don't necessarily believe that there was a guiding hand on this one, but you look at it and you think, well, hang on a minute, this was meant to be. Because they broke up once, nearly twice. They had so
You're talking about when you're talking broke up once, twice. Yes, you're talking about what year? What years did they almost break up?
There was a kind of breakup in '60 for a few days.
1960.
'60. There was a breakup on paper in '62 when the Beatles fired Pete Best and they got Ringo in. In order to void the contract, they actually, in legal terms, they claimed that they had broken the group up and reformed a minute later. There were just moments when you think, well, if this hadn't have happened, none of this would happen, and it always happened. But they always had the knack of attracting the right people to them. It's just something about them that made it work. It's the sheer force of their personalities, I think.
They, I always think about the songwriting.
Yeah.
People have this concept that John and Paul were writing songs constantly from the time they're about 16 right up until their first recording contract, and that it's just a fluid line. That is not the case. There was a period of time, quite a long 3-year period.
Yeah, that was a surprise to me because I too thought that was the way. They started writing together at the end of '57, beginning of '58. And they just carried on. But no, they stopped after a year or more because they'd done it. It was like we've written some songs and we put them behind us, and they didn't ever really play them. They were embarrassed of them. And when eventually, Brian Epstein became their manager, and that's why they started to play them again, because he recognized that it gave them what today we call a USP. It gave them something. Well, they already had much that nobody else had, but this gave them something else again. Not only are they dynamic, not only are they original, not only are they just incredibly charismatic, but also, did you know, 2 of them write their own songs? And it became something that Brian sold them on, if you like. So he encouraged them to start performing them, and they were a bit embarrassed in the early days in the Cavern. It was just like, this audience knows us for our, not just rock and roll, but principally rock and roll. But they tried it on the Cavern audience first because they felt they would be more forgiving. And then eventually, of course, within a year or more, that's all they can do because then the shows have contracted to half an hour and they've got to do their hits.
The Malcolm Gladwell, a couple of years ago, wrote this famous essay in one of his books about the 10,000 hours and claimed that the Beatles, the outliers, and that the Beatles had their 10,000 hours and that's what made them great. But a lot of people have their 10,000 hours and never become anything close to the Beatles. So something else is at work there. Something happens. They are, what's clear when you read this book, and I've had the honor to talk to Ringo mostly, and some to Paul. And what comes across, especially in talking to Ringo not that long ago, is he made it clear there were a lot of bands in Liverpool.
Yeah.
There were a ton of bands in Liverpool.
Yeah.
They were not considered by many people to be one of the premier bands in Liverpool. And then they go off to Hamburg and something happens. Do you have any sense of what it was? And I think it was more than 10,000 hours. Something happened that changed the equation.
Yeah, well, first of all, though there were many groups in Liverpool, they were, in a sense, in the second flush because the true rock and roll began in Liverpool in 56, 57, like it did in most places. And they were really just schoolboys, like George was 13, 14. And the skiffle was the music that they were playing.
Lonnie Donegan.
Exactly, yeah. So Ringo was in the biggest group. Ringo was always in the biggest group in Liverpool. He was in the biggest skiffle group, the Eddie Clayton group. He was in the biggest rock group before the Beatles, which was Rory Storm. But the Beatles watched all this and they didn't really have the experience to join in. They were just watching from the sidelines. The difference between them and the others to begin with anyway was the fact that most of the other guys were factory guys. You know, they would leave school and go and work in the factory. The Beatles had this kind of art school element to them that was crucial to their development because John and Stuart both went to art school, Stuart Sutcliffe, that is. And Paul and George were next door, and they were very arty as well, not in the art school, but they were arty too. So the Beatles thought differently. Just calling themselves Beatles was different to anybody else because the others were all Rory Storm and the Hurricanes and Cass and the Casanovas.
That's a difference too, is that the Beatles, and a lot of this again, people now, because the Beatles changed so much, people become inured or dulled to what a revolution it was, what a revelation it was too. They were different because most bands were built around the front guy. So it was unusual for a band to have really just be a unit of equals.
Yeah, very unusual. They had no recognizable leader. John actually was the leader within the group psychologically. He was the leader. He started it. He was the eldest. But he exercised a democracy whereby everyone got a say and there was no obvious frontman. And that was a strength that they had. So they go off to Hamburg in Germany in August 1960 as pretty much beginners still. They haven't really had a lot of stage experience. They've got a new drummer who they've never played with and a bass guitarist who's learning his instrument. They're all learning, really, because they haven't had much time on stage. But straight away, when they go there and they're confronted with the notion of having to play 6, 7 or 8 hours a night, they come up with this incredible idea, unlike anybody else, of let's not repeat ourselves. Let's make sure that if anyone happens to be in this bar at 8 o'clock in the evening and then comes back at 1:30, that he won't hear us do the same song, as if anyone would have noticed. But it was a challenge for themselves. And so what we're looking at here is guys who call themselves by a different kind of name, who have different origins, and who, when they get to Hamburg, present themselves with challenges. And the combination of these things, plus, of course, the extraordinary talent that they have, they flower hugely, hugely. So many groups went to Hamburg and came back pretty much the same. The Beatles went to Hamburg and came back completely refashioned. Yeah.
Fans who had known them in Liverpool before they went and then saw them afterwards were blown away.
You would be right, but for the fact that no one had really seen them in Liverpool before they went. They were really so much on the fringes of what was happening that no one had seen them. So when they came back and they were billed as being the Beatles from Germany, some of the kids who saw them actually said, "You speak good English." They said, "Well, we only lived down the road."
Right. People thought they were German.
They assumed they had to be German, the Beatles from Hamburg. And they knocked everybody over. They completely, because everyone else is in nice little suits. And they're doing, the big trend that year was a group called The Shadows, a bit like the American group The Ventures. Everything kind of twangy guitar solos posted through an echo box.
Also, I remember The Shadows would, that thing that looks ridiculous now, but people, you know, 5 guys playing their instruments and doing little dance steps in unison as they choreographed, which the Beatles thought was absolute bullshit.
Well, they were lucky to have missed that trend while they were away. It all happened, and they came back and went, "What's everybody doing?" And are we going to do that? Of course, we're not. They always, the thing about the Beatles is, and it's true, you tend to think of this being true for Rubber Soul or Revolver or the White Album or Abbey Road, that they were original and always trying to find some new sound. But in fact, that evolution of always wanting to be different from everybody else, never abiding by the common rules, and always feeling that we'll do it our way, no matter what people think, we'll do it our way. That begins, well, it begins when they're schoolboys, but it particularly begins when they get back from Hamburg, because they have a name like nobody else, they're playing music like nobody else, they look like nobody else, and they are extraordinarily magnetic on stage. I've got so many eyewitness accounts in this book of their impact on the audience. So what happens in the world from 64, 5, 6, say, happens in microcosm in Liverpool in 61 and 2. And it's a magical story.
You've done an incredible amount of work where you go to primary sources. Like you decided that you needed to read every issue of the Liverpool Echo. And you started what year?
55.
55.
Spot checks for earlier stuff, but 55 for a solid read.
And we're talking about something that is not available. You're not going to find it online. You can't zip through it on your computer. You have to go to the library. Where did you go to find every issue of the Liverpool Echo?
To the British Library in London, where they have everything. But it's a slow old job, because it was a broadsheet newspaper of 16 to 20 pages a day, packed with news. I mean, these days it's not a shadow, like no newspaper now is a shadow of what it used to be. But I needed to immerse myself in Liverpool. I wasn't there. In fact, at that point, I wasn't even alive, 55. So though it's a world that I recognise because I grew up in Britain in the 60s, I needed to put myself so that I could put the reader in Liverpool in the 50s.
I think that's what makes this work, sets this work apart. I think a lot of people can start with, you know, every Beatle book I know starts with the Blitz. And you, to the point where you just know the story so well about, they grew up, they were war babies, and then, you know, John's the brash one, and Paul's the cute, quiet one, and George, you know, and you get...
Quiet.
Exactly. Or he's a cute one, and then George is the quiet one, and it to the point where it's like it deadens you. And I think the fact that you went back and you're actually looking at the primary sources like an archaeologist, saying, I have to get to what is it like to live in Liverpool in 1958 in March. I'm reading something that they would have read, so that you can get to stuff that they will probably not even remember.
Yeah, what's on at the cinemas and the theatres, what musicians are visiting and where they're playing and when. So because sometimes they went to shows. The whole book is sequential, and there's no hindsight thinking in it. So I don't hint of the future because it's not known.
That's the feeling you get when you read it, is what's going to happen to these guys.
Yeah, it will unfold.
Which is actually... It's fascinating because it does suck you in. You think, I wonder if these guys are going to pull it together, because, as I said earlier, you know, they are not. They're very creative. They're very talented. They're not always disciplined.
No.
They're not people pleasers always. They are when they really have to be. But there are a lot of times when they're screwing up early on, putting the band together and trying to keep it afloat, and that's what I keep going back to, is this sense that this could easily not have happened. These guys could have messed it up. And
yeah, I'm very keen not to write a book about legends. You know, the two words that drive me mad these days more than any other are legends and icon. Iconic. Everybody's iconic.
I won't let people use those terms with me. Because I find, I don't know why you're laughing. One of the things that you talk about, these miracles. So one of them that's absolutely miraculous. I mean, Lennon meets McCartney, and we all know that that's fairly miraculous.
Yeah.
George, it's just the right chemistry. John has a personality trait where he can be brash, he can be a bit of a bully, but he tolerates younger kids if they show deference and if they have something to offer. So people forget George was much younger than John. A few years is a massive gap back then. So George is this kid who doesn't seem very impressive at all, but John lets him into the fold. It almost seems crucial that John has this trait where he wants to dominate, but at the same time he lets people in who other kids may not have let in.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's the guy who introduced John to Paul, Ivan Vaughan, was a childhood friend. He went to school with Paul, but he was a childhood friend of John. John had a gang. He always had a gang around him, and he was always the leader, just by natural order. And instead of it being John, Paul, George and Ringo, it was John, Pete, Nige and Ivan. And Ivan's remark, because unfortunately he's not with us anymore, but one of the remarks he made about John was that he was extraordinarily accepting of him, though he was younger and didn't have as much about him as John did. John was accepting, yes, you can come and play, bring your cars and we'll play cars, whatever. They were like 5, 6, 7 years old. So it was too when he was a teenager. He was 17 and a half when he met George for the first time. And John was quite an old 17 and a half. You know, he had sideburns. He was a teddy boy, which was, the British style. That was kind of something like Elvis, but seemingly, from external appearances at least, aggressive. You would cross the road to avoid people like that. And George is just turning 15. In fact, he's not yet 15. And he's a small boy still. He's not yet adolescent. So there is a world of difference between them. And not many 17-and-a-half-year-olds are interested in having a 15-year-old kid tagging around. Now, John did do an interview in 1970 with Rolling Stone in which he talked about how he remembered George being this kid who was always hanging around all the bloody time and, always here again. I think he's speaking of one or two particular instances when he was going out with his girlfriend Cynthia and George was bunking off school and he would tag along to the pictures with him in the afternoon. But generally speaking, George was there because John allowed him to be there. That is a very special trait to have, and it meant that he was open to whatever George could bring. And you mentioned deference earlier. I'm not sure that John particularly wanted people to defer to him. He had to have the last word, that's for sure. But what he most valued was people who stood up to him. Because if you were a pushover, he'd push you over.
Right.
But if you stood up to him, fine, you can stay. And George did stand up to him because George, though only not yet 15, always had a kind of a wisdom and a quiet strength about him that John obviously recognised.
We're talking about miraculous events. Brian Epstein shows up. And now, looking back, he is a gift from the heavens for these guys because he sees their talent. He's the only one who sees them in 62 and says, they're going to be the biggest thing ever. I found them. I am not a manager, but I'm going to be one. They are it. They are going to be it. He saw the whole thing, and he also had taste. And you think about how many people, how many bands get the wrong manager early on. Almost everyone.
Yes.
He had taste, and he cared about them. And he put them ahead of, what business concerns.
I would say that, in fact, there are quotes from Brian in which he says this, that he devoted himself to them.
Yeah.
And he was a man of tremendous energy. When he was fired by a new passion, he would pour everything into it. He would just consume himself with whatever it was that was interesting him. And the Beatles were miraculous to him. They came along at just the right time in his life, much as he came along at just the right time in their lives. It was the perfect marriage, if you like, of manager and artists. He not only cared, he was honest. How many rock managers have been honest through the history of rock and roll?
Yeah.
But again, it's another example of them finding the right person at the right time, which was a habit that they happened to them so often that you can't help but think, well, yeah, of course, yeah, it was going to happen, wasn't it? But in fact, one of the questions, I mean, people often ask me, what if so-and-so? What if so-and-so hadn't happened? I'm not very good on what-if questions because it didn't happen, so what's there to talk about? Yeah. And also, I don't know. Who does? With probably one exception, and that is, what if Brian Epstein hadn't come along? Would the Beatles still have made it? People ask. What I found with this book is that had he not come along, they would have broken up. Because they went to Hamburg the second time in the spring of 1961. They came back at the end of June, or the beginning of July, and they started playing again on Merseyside. They were commanding about 5 times the nightly fee of any other group. They were packing them in. So promoters paid this high fee through gritted teeth, but look at the business they brought in for everybody. There was a newspaper called Merseybeat by this point, and they wrote about the Beatles more than any other. And when the opinion poll, the popularity poll ran, the Beatles won it. They were far and away the biggest group in Liverpool. So, and this is typical of them, they got bored. There were no challenges for them. From July into August into September, they're beginning to go, well, where next? Because it was called a circuit. You would play the circuit, so-and-so hall on a Monday night, so-and-so hall on a Tuesday night. And literally it was a circuit. They were just going round and round and round and round and round, and that might be enough for most. But for Lennon and McCartney and Harrison, and Pete Best was there as well, it was just like, what next? What next? You know, where's the challenge? And Bob Wooler, who was their confidant at that time, he was the guy who was, they saw him virtually every night at the different halls. He was the DJ and the MC and all of that. Kind of like the Alan Freed of Liverpool, but not as wild. He is categoric, or was categoric, that they were going to break up. Unless something happened for them, some breakthrough happened, they were going to break up. And John and Paul go off to Paris in October '61, and they leave George and Pete behind, and they break the bookings with a few promoters, which burns even more bridges. One by one, they were pissing off every promoter that they were who was paying them. So John and Paul faced the prospect of returning to Liverpool and virtually no bookings anymore because they've annoyed everybody one time too many. Yeah. And Brian comes along. Yeah. And Brian comes along and he makes a promise to them to double their income, which is really hard considering that he can't book them into any of the places they've been playing because the promoters don't want them anymore. But he's going to double their income and he's going to get them onto the radio and hopefully television, and he will do all he can to get them a record contract. That's the Holy Grail. That is the Holy Grail. Make a record. Yeah.
I've seen, I know you've seen these, but I've seen Brian Epstein would make these sheets, these booking sheets that you're, okay, lads, you're going to go and play. And I've seen them actually typed out. And I think Ringo's mother kept everything, and he put out a book not too long ago. And you can actually look at them.
Yes.
And what's really interesting about them, I don't know the names of, rural towns around London, but you'll know which places I'm talking about. But there'll be a sheet that you're supposed to go to Oxfordshire and play a gig at this hall. And it will say in it, it's typed out, supposedly pretty good audience, but they're very Protestant, so some of your shenanigans won't go over too well, so maybe you want to pull it back there. Details about what he's done his research and he's found out. I mean, this is when these gigs may not even be that consequential, but he's telling them this is the advanced stuff you need to know about playing that small hall. And it's important that you remember these things.
Yeah. Brian's attention to detail was extraordinary. And he presented them with 2 pieces of paper every week. One was the coming week's engagements, as you've described it, Monday here, Tuesday there. Yep. 2 half-hour slots, 1 45-minute slot. Give them a good show. It's the first show for such and such a promoter. Do your best to impress him because we'll get more, and so on. And the second sheet was the last week's accounts, down to the penny.
Yeah.
And they would actually go to the office on a Friday and pick up their money, which in a little wage packet with the top sealed over and the slip inside explaining how much it was, because it was cash. People, they didn't have bank accounts.
Yeah.
We're talking here of a completely different age, if you like, no bank accounts as well as no mobile phones. So Brian was incredible for them because it gave them a level of organisation that they'd never had. They were always a bit haphazard on their own. Whenever they had to organise themselves, they would usually turn up late, ragged in some way, and their amplifiers were shockingly poor. And piece by piece, he actually got them up to scratch. The main one, of course, is he got them to tidy up their appearance.
Mm-hmm. Which meant the myth was they didn't like being put, they had these leather suits and they didn't like these new outfits, but that's been disproven.
Yeah. Mankind being what it is, authors do like to have someone to pick on, or the public do as well. And I always feel with this story, you can't really pick on John, Paul, George or Ringo, so you pick on some of the people around them and give them a bit of a kicking. Mm-hmm. And Brian he's suffered a bit of a kicking from many authors who wish to portray a particular element of his life without necessarily looking at it in balance. And I'm only interested in the truth. I'm not interested in agendas or bias of any kind whatsoever. So I look at what Brian did for them in totality. And the business with the suits actually turns out on close inspection to be a completely different way to the way it's been projected, which is that he said to them, if you stay dressed as you are, all in leather trousers, leather, usually wore black T-shirts, leather jackets, leather trousers, and something like cowboy boots or just Cuban heel boots of some kind. That's fine, but I can't book you into places outside Liverpool because they don't know you. They don't know of your reputation. On image alone, they would say, well, we're not having them, because they look like trouble. They look like, they dressed on stage as the kind of person you wouldn't want to have in the hall from an audience point of view. I mean, even in the Cavern, it was meant to be no jeans, and they're on stage playing in jeans. So there was, the management always had to wrestle with something when the Beatles were around. So he said, if you carry on dressed like that, your opportunities will be more limited than you would wish them to be. So you've got a choice. You can either change, you can either stay as you are and stay pretty much playing the same places, or you can change your appearance into something else, something more presentable in the mode of the day, and that'll be problem solved. So with that information, they decided that they would get suits. And in fact, I found the tailor, a guy called Walter Smith, who is 80-something now, who was a young 20, 30-something then, who fitted them up for their suits. And he told me how particular they were about the particular narrowness of the lapels and the narrowness of the trousers. The trousers kept going back for alteration. The narrow ties that they had, they were basically going for a kind of Italian mod look. Now, no other group in Liverpool who wore suits wore anything like those suits. They were still different. They still maintained their individuality. They just got out of the leather. But it was their decision. And this was what Brian did time and again. Now, one of the reasons why it's laughably untrue that he could have forced them into suits is because there is no way that he could have forced Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and ultimately Starr to do anything if they didn't want to do it, because we're talking here about some of the world's most opinionated young men. They always had an opinion. They were never shy to air it. It goes on to this day. And if they were being told to do something that they didn't want to do, they would usually tell you where to get off. And Brian learned the hard way that very quickly, in fact, that, if he tried saying, boys, do this, f off, Brian.
In that, watch the language. I'm kidding. It really doesn't matter. In that vein, Paul pretty quickly butts heads with Brian Epstein, which is interesting because you always think of him. It's the moment in Yellow Submarine. He's where he's thrown the bouquet, and he's the diplomat. He's the darling. He's gonna make. That Lennon's the troublemaker. And that Paul is lubricating the situation, making it all move. But Paul had a side to him that was difficult, and he was a real problem for Brian Epstein at some point.
They all had their difficult sides, but Paul's was the one that Brian had the most trouble with, for sure, because Paul was the most conspicuously ambitious for the Beatles. John and George were both ambitious too, no doubt about it, but they would be more laid back. You wouldn't see it quite so openly as you would with Paul. And again, I wasn't there, but I spoke to so many people who were, and you get to see the personality through all the years anyway. Paul has never liked anyone telling him what to do. There are quotes from him in this book that go right back to his earlier school days at the age of 5, where he didn't like the teachers because they told him what to do. He had a job in a factory for a couple of months, which is a nice little tale that's in the book. Didn't like the boss because he kept telling him what to do. So Brian comes along and says, boys, you should be here on Friday, you should be there on Saturday. So we should. I'll be there if I want to be there, but don't tell me I should. So he and Brian did kind of lock horns. And it was a relationship that never really was very brilliant. Even in Brian's 1964 autobiography, A Cellar Full of Noise, which is fairly anodyne in the way that it approached most of the subjects, he openly reveals that Paul is his biggest problem. Yeah,
I've read that book and I remembered at the time being struck that it's this very cheerful, oh, the boys and the lads, and it's this it feels like this could be a puff piece. And then there is a part where he's very revealing about Paul being a bit of a prima donna. There's actually a time that stands out. It's in your book where Paul refuses to show up for a gig, and it costs them the gig. Yeah. And they go to his house, and he says, I'm not going.
Yeah. Well, in fact, it manifested itself in the very first meeting, the first constructive business meeting they had with Brian Epstein, beginning of December 1961. He's only known them a few days. He's already been down to London to see if he can get them a recording contract. In fact, they kind of have one already, and they've signed the contract, and it's all in German, and they've got no idea what they've signed. They signed anything until Brian came along. They have this meeting at which they're going to discuss how things evolve from here, and Paul doesn't show up. And they wait for him, and eventually George goes and phones him, and turns out that Paul is in the bath. He's just got up and he's in the bath. And Brian is livid because, you know, the risk at this point is all of Brian's. You know, there was no risk for the Beatles in taking Brian as their manager. There was considerable risk for Brian because the Beatles' reputation was quite poor at that point amongst the people who, you know, were meant to employ them. And, you know, he faced the prospect of being embarrassed, of losing money and having them walk out on him and all those things. There was no contract yet. So where was Paul? And Paul was, I'll get there when I'm ready, is essentially what he was doing. And then a couple of months later, there's this 3 dates that Brian has arranged for them with Liverpool University. Different kind of audience. Again, as I said, because he couldn't book them where they had been playing, he was having to be imaginative in how they would find work. And Paul just, I'm not coming. Just said, I'm not coming, you know. He always felt that he was the one who was always trying to make things happen, and he kind of went, oh, no, tonight I can't be bothered. And it was a great embarrassment to Brian and annoying for the others. But we're talking about young guys here. We're not talking about mature men. We're talking here about kids, adolescents. Mm-hmm. And this is what happens. I mean, groups notoriously fight. Bands, they're called now, but in these days they're called groups. You hear incredible stories of bands on the road fighting. I mean, really, really fighting. Guys who hate each other. They go on stage and play, but they absolutely hate each other. The Beatles were not like that. The Beatles were great friends of one another, genuinely close friends, strong friends. And this is another reason why they were able to make it and make it so big and stay sane through, well, in volumes 2 and 3, years which are just beyond belief, in the sense that they'd never happened to anybody else ever. So that what they're experiencing, they experience for the first time. And they cope with it incredibly well. And that's because they are so tight. They're so
They always felt friends. They had an advantage over Elvis, that Elvis was, you know, Elvis was the one guy, and then he had he had his Memphis Mafia, but they're not going to tell him no.
Their lip service.
Yeah, and the Beatles always recognized they were fortunate that they had each other. That if one of them started to get a little inflated ego, they would feel,
they kept each other in check.
They kept each other in check.
Yeah. And they go through the 60s with a very small coterie of people around them. I mean,
it's really small. It's shocking when you look at, when you think about it's Neil Aspinall and
Mal Evans.
When you think about a band of that caliber, the biggest band, biggest show business act possibly in the history of the world, and they've got one guy schlepping their guitars, drums around and setting them up, and it's unheard of. It's insane that it didn't multiply to 15, 20 people.
Yeah, they never had a heavy. They never had an employee of theirs hit anybody. I mean, Neil could take care of himself, but he wasn't violent. He would make sure that they were unscathed, and that was it. That was his job. He would just say, "Get out of the way," but he wouldn't actually knock anybody out. And Mal was a big guy, but he wouldn't hit anybody either. So they came to America in 64, 65, 66 with extremely small retinue, like 5 people.
Yeah.
Brian, Mal, Neil, who else was there?
And then relying on the local police.
A driver, something.
Yeah, or something.
Yeah, which of course was problematic because in the States, particularly in 64, 65, not less in 66, I would say, the police always felt that the local police, wherever they arrived, they would handle it. And of course, they would always be caught out because of the sheer scope of the mania that was going on around them. And they got into some really dangerous situations, but they always got through. And they always got through. Those guys didn't suck up to them either. They spoke straight to them. The Beatles were straight talkers who appreciate people talking straight to them.
The crux of probably the whole story of the Beatles is the songwriting, which we touched on it before. But you have these guys. No one had done this before. They're writing their own songs. Yeah. And I've always thought the prelude to talking about that is their selection of covers that they did as a band were very unlike what other people were doing at the time. Yeah. Before they were performing their own songs for people, they were playing covers like everyone played covers. But they were playing different kinds of music. They intentionally wanted to play music that other people weren't playing. Yes. They played music by girl groups. They loved the girl groups of the American girl groups of the 60s. Yes. And they thought those were terrific songs. So I used to remember it dawning on me that, Boys, Ringo singing it. It's a great song, but you listen to it, and for a while I remember, long before I knew, when I first heard it, I thought, that's an odd song. Yeah. Why is Ringo singing about boys? It's got a homoerotic quality to it, which I rather enjoy now. But I found out later on that they just loved that song, and they decided we could change it to girls, but we're not going to do that, which is, who cares? Just play it that way. That they were consistently trying to find different kinds of material that probably expanded them greatly as musicians. Yeah, well, Liverpool, as we said earlier, had a rock and roll scene before the Beatles came along, in an embryonic form, if you like. It was the Beatles' return from Hamburg and their extraordinary popularity immediately that opened up the scene for everyone. And suddenly, in the wake of the Beatles, they are the top now. And in the wake of the Beatles, loads of other groups form, loads of different venues open, and there is suddenly a lot of competition. Mm-hmm. They're the headlining act, but the headlining act didn't necessarily play the last on the bill, which you'd get these days, because in those days, very few kids had a car. So the prime spot will be the one kind of 9 o'clock in the evening, because after that, the last buses go. In fact, if you watch some of the Beatles concert films from like Shea Stadium, for example, Paul does this thing of, this one's going to have to be our last song, and he taps his watch as if it's like, you've got to go and catch the last bus, and he does this thing with his hand, as if it's time to go home and go to bed now. Yeah. And that's because they played mid-evening in Liverpool rather than the end.
But the point is, there were so many other groups on the bill, sometimes as many as 10 acts on one bill. Great rock promotions in Liverpool. There wasn't anything like this happening anywhere else in the world. They would be in the dressing room and they'd hear the other groups who were on before them doing their songs. So, you know, Jerry and the Pacemakers just done Long Tall Sally. What should we do? Oh, we'll cross it out then, or whatever. So they realised that it would be to their advantage if they developed a repertoire that was unlike anybody else's. And so they started digging around the B-sides of records. They were a professional group, the Beatles. That is, they didn't have, when they came back from Hamburg, the second time particularly, they didn't have to go and look for any other jobs. They could earn a living, and a very good living at that, more than their parents were earning, just by playing rock and roll at night. That liberated their daytimes. Instead of working in the factory or wherever, they could be in the record shops. And they spent a lot of time in the record shops, squeezed into the little listening booths called browseries, asking the assistants, usually the girls, to put on anything American. The myth that they got everything from the sailors who sailed the Atlantic between New York and Liverpool is just that. It's a myth. They got their repertoire from records, because most of the American record labels had a licensing deal with a UK label and they would be issued in Britain. So in the shop, they'd be listening to anything American, and they'd listen to the B-side as well as the A-side, and they found so much music that nobody else had the opportunity to hear. And so they did these songs that nobody else knew, and they also arranged them, because often rock and roll songs would have a piano or a saxophone or a horn section. They just had 3 guitars and drums, so they would do an instant rearrangement, and they'd play it like that night. And probably it was a little bit rough because they hadn't played it before, but they were playing so often. They were playing typically, 61, they played 350 dates in 1 year, in 365 days. 62 was only a few less. So they're rehearsing on stage, if you like, and they are dynamic. And what they love is rhythm and blues. They love American rhythm and blues. And rhythm and blues then had 2 definitions. It could mean the kind of Willie Dixon, Howlin' Wolf rhythm and blues like the Stones got into, or it could mean the other rhythm and blues, the Billboard R&B chart, which is what became soul, which is, you know, the Shirelles, the Isley Brothers, and so on.
Smokey Robinson
and the Miracles. That was their passion.
So I've always had this theory that people say, how do songwriters like that come along? Yeah. And you think, okay, well, they obviously had this incredible genius aptitude, but what certainly helps is that they had big ears. They listened to everything and they sucked it in. And when you say that they had to rearrange these songs themselves, and you also remember that today, if I play some guitar, if I want to learn a song, it's instantaneous. Yeah. I can go and hit an app and type in the song that I want to learn, and it will tell me exactly what the chords are, when they come in. If I want to play the lead, I can find out how to play the lead. I can find out what key it's in. I can watch video of 55,000 people doing it with close-ups of the hands. They had none of that. Yeah. So they had to absorb the essence of songwriting by listening and playing all these great cover tunes that they loved, which I think must sink in at some point. Yeah. Where their education was playing so many different kinds of music. Yeah.
George Harrison had this great quote of, you know, in the late 50s, you could barely get a cup of sugar, let alone a rock and roll record. Yeah. And because it was so scarce, because the thing that they most sought after was so scarce, they went looking for it deep. You know, Paul tells a fantastic anecdote of how he and George got on a bus to go to the other side of Liverpool for someone who would show them a chord.
The B7.
The B7 chord, yeah. And that hunger, that desire is a very good driver. If you've got everything so easy and laid out for you.
Yes. If they had apps where they could get everything, they'd become bored. And as you said, the lethal thing for the Beatles was boredom. And
yes. Also, they wouldn't have anything that nobody else didn't have either. Right. You know, I mean, what was going to make them unique? The effort of going and finding something was making them unique. they had big ears, as you say, and they did absorb everything. And that's what the best creative talent will do. Suck it all in, add your own original mix to it, and then put it back out again in a different form. And at the time that they get their record contract, the Beatles' major influence is the music of Jerry Goffin and Carole King, the songs of Goffin and King. All those wonderful songs by the Shirelles and Little Eva and so on, the Crickets. And so when they began recording, Lennon and McCartney were writing in that vogue. The songs on their first LP, Please Please Me, are all their own songs, are kind of like Goffin and King songs, where somehow or other there's this wonderful mix of an upbeat melody with a downbeat lyric. It was a wonderful knack that Goffin and King managed, and particularly appealed to John and Paul. So without any of these influences from America, you wouldn't have had the Beatles. There's a great story in the book of a guy called Tony Carricker, who went to art school with John, now passed away, but I got a fantastic interview with him, spent a day with him. And he was an ardent record collector, and he discovered in the late 1950s that you could send away to the American embassy in London, in Grosvenor Square in London, and they would send you Library of Congress recordings made by Alan Lomax down in the field somewhere in Tennessee or wherever, all those great original early blues of Sleepy John Estes and all these fantastic American blues artists that no one really had ever heard of. And the American embassy would send post-free, well, return postage paid, in fact, records on loan to anyone who asked. Wow. And so John got access to all these American blues records courtesy of the American government, which I think is pretty cool. And it didn't necessarily inform his musical style, but he knew it. From that point on, he knew it. And he could speak about it with some authority because of the American government.
I think there's this moment, and I'll back up a second. I had the great opportunity to hang out with you a little bit in London, and you gave me a fantastic tour of Abbey Road Studio, which, you know, was a dream come true for me, because I had read everything you had written about the Abbey Road and the studio sessions, and I had an idea in my head of what it was going to be like, but then to actually see the place, it was the most I've ever known about a place and not have seen it. And then I saw it, and you showed me around. You're very generous with your time. And then afterwards, we were walking along, and we were going to go get a cup of coffee, and you pointed out to me, you said, that right there is the place where, it was just a few blocks from Abbey Road, that's where Brian sent the telegram to the boys to tell them, just secured a recording contract. I think you said need new songs. Yes. Which they misinterpreted, is that right?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what the telegram said now. Please rehearse new material, I think is what it said.
New material, right.
Yeah, and in Hamburg, perhaps it just fed the way they were thinking anyway. John and Paul took that as a sign to actually resume songwriting. They had actually both recently written in spring '62 a song each. Paul did one called Pinwheel Twist, which we've never heard, which was a Twist record, obviously. And John did Ask Me Why, which eventually came out. But they took it as a sign to, you know, come up with something new. And they didn't want to, when they recorded, they didn't want to do anybody else's songs. The shift was here, we will do our own.
See, that's doesn't sound like a leap to anybody today. No. It sounds natural. At the time, that was, here are these guys, they shouldn't have made it this far. There was, as we've said, 10,000 ways it could have gone wrong, should have gone wrong. And now they're getting a recording contract. And nobody has a recording contract.
Yeah.
And this is where, if you're smart, you play it safe. And you do some of the covers. It's going to sound great. We know how to do this. And they say, it's our own songs or nothing.
Yeah.
That's absolutely stunning.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's absolute indicative of who they have always been by this point and who they will always be through all the years to come. What they don't know is that they're being given a song to record, a song called How Do You Do It, which they don't like, but actually rearrange to record it. And at the end of recording it, when it looks like the thing that they least want to happen is bound to happen. They are going to have to come out with a song that isn't theirs. John goes and talks to George Martin. Whenever there was a heavy moment in the Beatles, though there was a democracy there, the other three would always just keep quiet and look at John, and John would have to go and say whatever needed to be said. And at that point, it was clear that he was the leader. And he went up and said to George Martin, we really, really, really don't want you to release that song that we've just recorded. Please, please use our own song. And George said, no, actually, no. But in the course of the 7 days that followed, other pressures came to bear that the Beatles knew nothing about. And George Martin did drop How Do You Do It? And the Beatles always assumed that it was George who had listened to their request and thought, as a result of that, what a fantastic guy he was, which of course he was. They liked him anyway, but this was it. You know, George, great old George, he's listened to our request, you know. But it wasn't quite like that, but it looked that way. And so their first record was their record, Love Me Do, and their second one was their record, Please Please Me, and then it never stopped. There was no question then of them covering anybody else's. Though they covered for albums, they didn't cover for singles, they always wrote their own. And John and Paul had a particular view of what made a single and what made an album track. And that being something about energy and speed. Mm-hmm. They never quite defined what it was themselves, but it's clear when you look at what their choices were they knew a song like I Wanna Hold Your Hand is a single,
yeah,
for example. This Boy is a B-side. But, what a B-side.
Yeah, they had some B-sides.
Oh, yeah.
You also discovered in your research, you debunk another myth. And this was really stunning because most people, the story that I've always heard is that nobody wants the Beatles. No record company wants the Beatles. And they can't get a recording contract. George Martin sees something. He's produced the Goon Show. He's not sure about them as musicians, but he thinks they've got something, and he takes a chance. That's not quite true. Is that right?
No, it's not. You said debunk myths. I didn't set out to debunk any myths. Yeah.
But I know you didn't set out. It debunked a myth for me.
That's right. What happens is that they just kind of fall away because when you actually tell the real story, you think, well, hang on, wasn't it? Well, obviously this is what happened. Right. The reality is that I too, like everybody else, when I wrote the recording sessions book, I assumed that the Beatles' first visit to Abbey Road was an audition of some kind, a test. An artist test or a commercial test, that would have been the phrase of the time. Until in 1991, I was rooting around in the archives at EMI. I love paperwork. Paperwork is what I search the world for. And I found all sorts of pieces of paper which pointed very clearly to the fact that when the Beatles first came to Abbey Road, they were actually already under contract, that there was not a test at all. They were already signed. So why would they be signed when George Martin hasn't even met them yet? So I was working with George on a TV special, The Making of Sergeant Pepper, and I spread out I photocopied everything, and I spread them all out in front of George on the kind of edit suite desk. And I said, I don't understand what's happening here. Can you please explain to me? The documents had his signature on them from '62. And he looked at them and he had no answer. He couldn't actually explain what it was. He was baffled by it. And I could see he was genuinely baffled. He kind of talked himself into believing the other story of how they were signed, and therefore, when confronted with this, genuinely no longer remembered it that way. That was okay for the time. It left me unsatisfied, but I knew that there was something there that was unsolved. But when I came to write these books, I knew I had to get to the bottom of that one. I couldn't just have a conundrum in the book of such magnitude. So it all fell into place when I lucked into, well, I've been looking for him for years, but in the end I lucked into finding a guy called Kim Bennett, male Kim, who was, he worked at an EMI music publishing firm called Ardmore and Beechwood, and he had liked a Lennon and McCartney song that he had heard on the Decca tape, the failed audition for Decca. and wanted to publish it. And through his interest, the Beatles, Brian Epstein found himself with George Martin in May 1962, discussing a contract. Now, why was George Martin offering them a contract? Well, it's a convoluted and quite multifaceted combination of reasons, but the reality is that he was given them as a chore. He had his arm twisted.
It was an assignment.
It was an assignment. In effect, they were signed by EMI, and then it was like, well, who should we give them to? EMI had 4 in-house producers at that time. And for various reasons, George was given that job. So they were signed. He had never met them. The only bit of their music he had heard he didn't like, didn't rate at all highly. So why on earth would he have signed them? When he met them, and this is what's so tremendous about George Martin being the right guy, when he met them, he recognized immediately that these guys were original, that they had attitude, that they had opinions, that they spoke up, that they were funny, that they were charismatic, and that they were the something. Who else was called the something? He was himself a maverick in everything he did. He didn't like abiding by the rules. He was always trying to subvert the rules in the best way possible, in the creative sense. And when he met them, he recognized that they were the same. So he knew that they were good guys and that something might come of this, but what would they record? And it was at that point that he decided he would find them a song, which was the role of a producer. He wasn't even called a producer then. He was an A&R man. And A&R people at record companies will tend to, these days, will scout the talent, but they won't necessarily take them into the studio. But his job was to find the artist and repertoire. So he found the artist, then he went looking for the repertoire, which was how do you do it? And then he said, come down, boys, you're going to make a record. The great strength of the relationship between the Beatles and George Martin manifests itself very fast. By November of '62, still within the realm of this book, he is completely tuned into who they are. He realizes how original they are. He wants to do an album with them. He talks about going to the Cavern and making their first album a live album, which is what Please Please Me would have been. And he's fully tuned in. And when they make the Please Please Me single, he presses the button to say, congratulations, boys, you've just made your first #1. And he meant it. He wasn't bull. He wasn't speaking bull, because George didn't do that. He was straight. We talked about how lucky the Beatles were to have Brian. George Martin was the only producer in London who could possibly have coped with their attitude. The only producer in London who would have allowed them to start breaking the rules as quickly as they did. Because within 1963, they get very comfortable in the studio and start trying things. And most producers would have said, well, you do it my way, boys, or not at all. But he was receptive to their ideas, probably knew it was unwise to stop them because they were so strong in their opinions, but he was receptive. He also didn't insert his name as the co-composer on the B-side or the A-side even, like some of his colleagues did, which was a fairly well-known trick in the business, in order to earn a little bit of money on the side. He was straight. So they had the best manager and they had the best producer, and this has just kind of happened to them. If you like.
Because you were talking about George Martin, to this day, Ringo has a grudge against the recently departed George Martin. To this day, can't let it go that he was asked to sit on the sidelines while Andy White, Andy White, the session drummer, sits in. And Ringo's never forgotten it and is mad about it. And it just made me think, Ringo has always been people will agree it's Lennon, McCartney, and then, of course, Harrison's brilliant. And then I'm a big defender of Ringo's because it's easy for people if they're looking for who do we make a joke about. I talked to many drummers. The drummer in my band, who's a brilliant drummer, Ringo is one of his favorites. It's just, but he's always, he has an interesting spot. And sometimes he's underappreciated, but it does feel to me like he was crucial to the whole thing coming together in the end.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was. I like the fact that we know that he still has a problem with George Martin having replaced him 54 years ago.
Yeah.
We know that because he said it. And what that says is that he's a grudge keeper.
Yeah. Yeah.
He got over it. I mean, he and George went on to have a fantastic relationship, mutually respectful. And Ringo never, ever let him down as a drummer after that first session. But the fact that Ringo kept the grudge tells us something about Ringo's personality that we need to know, because they always remember who did them down. Not many have, but in the very early days when they were told, you'll never make it from Liverpool, it's just like, well, we will, you know. And there's a great anecdote, a few pages in the book, where I describe the first trip to London to promote a record, and everybody's telling them, you'll never make it from Liverpool, and you'll never make it with the name Beatles. What a stupid name, change it. And they just thought, yes, we will, and we'll show you. You mentioned defending Ringo. I think we don't need to defend Ringo anymore because it's time for the attacks on Ringo to stop. You know, again, I said earlier that people like to have a victim figure that they can beat. Brian Epstein being a notable one, Magic Alex, the Maharishi, people like to make fun of all these people without actually looking at their role in things properly. Ringo's been something of a laughingstock since '63, as soon as they broke through, because he sat at the back, because he was a bit smaller than them, because he had a bigger nose, because he didn't sing so many songs, because he appeared to be the spare part. But within that group, there were 4 of them, and they all recognised the absolute fundamental necessity of having each other there. Ringo they picked him. He's the chosen one, if you like. He's the guy they went, we want you.
They went to a lot of trouble to get Ringo.
They did.
At a very difficult time.
Yeah.
When it would have been easier to just stick with Pete Best.
Oh, they were never going to do that.
Yeah.
Never. I mean, the thing about Pete was he lasted much longer than they wanted him to because of their own lethargy, really, and their own, as John called it, cowardice, because they didn't want to face sacking him because they thought he might hit them. But Ringo was the guy they actually went out and got. They did have 1 or 2 other drummers temporarily, or had people in. There are people who can claim that they really wanted me, but no, they really did want Ringo. And the beauty of that is what Neil Aspinall explained to me is the chain, which is the name order John, Paul, George, Ringo. John started it, he brings in Paul. Paul brings in George. George brings in Ringo. They all wanted Ringo, but George was the one who really made the move to bring him, to make sure that they landed him. So that meant that Ringo's relationship with George was always that bit closer because he knew that he was there because of George. But the reason why they wanted him is because they loved playing with him. I mean, when you're in a band and you're on the front line and the drummer is not the right guy for whatever reason, you know it. And similarly, when the chemistry is right, you know it. And every time they played with Ringo before he joined, it felt great.
Yeah, they played with him numerous times because they would always switch off. And if their drummer if they didn't have a drummer, they would, and they were playing the same venue as Rory Storm.
Yeah.
And there's great pictures Ringo has of him hanging out with John and Paul and George when he's not even in the Beatles.
Yeah,
they're hanging out after a show.
They really knew him from 1960 in Hamburg because his group, Rory Storm and the Hurricanes and the Beatles, shared 12-hour stints, 6 nights a week at the Kaiserkeller Club, the bar in Hamburg. So why did they want Ringo? They wanted him because, first of all, his character and personality was a fit. Secondly, tempo. Rock solid tempo, unwavering beat, metronomic, perfect for guitarists and singers. The guy before Pete, they always felt that he wavered on his beat. You know, he was erratic, he speeded up, he slowed down. You know the jokes about drummers. Ringo was, rock solid.
He's also rock solid through every outtake.
Yeah.
He's never, it's never Ringo that's the problem.
And all styles. I mean, if they play Honey Pie, it's a kind of 1920s dance band shuffle, there's Ringo. If they're playing Helter Skelter, it's heavy rock, there's Ringo. If they're playing, or whatever it was, you name it.
Yeah.
All the incredible variety of styles of the Beatles' music. I mean, the Beatles' music catalogue is breathtaking in its breadth and depth of musical innovation and style. One drummer.
Yeah.
all the way through, except for a couple of tracks on the White Album when he walked out for a while. I love the fact that Ringo was the first Beatle to quit, by the way, because it just shows the man's strength of mind.
Yeah.
And that was the strength of mind that they all needed. You know, Pete, I'm not trying to be anti-Pete here, but for the Beatles, the contrast with Pete was dramatic.
Yeah.
Because Pete was quiet, very, very quiet, wouldn't say anything. And when they finished the playing and they'd go out to a bar, Pete would go home. It was only ever the three of them. With Ringo, they became a foursome for the first time.
It's the four-headed monster.
Yeah.
That's what, when the Beatles would go and check out the Stones.
Yeah.
Stones would see these four guys in leather coats come in and say, it's the four-headed monster. They did everything together.
I love the fact that the Beatles enjoyed each other's company so much that whenever any one of them got an enthusiasm for something, which they always did because they were enthusiastic guys and very receptive to anything around them, a fashion, for example, or a gimmick, a toy, all four of them will get them.
Or a mustache.
Yeah.
Or a beard. Exactly. They all get them.
Yeah, they did these things in unison. And it wasn't as something as ordained as, you know, next week we will all do this. They just turned each other on with their interests and their ideas and their habits. So they were an extraordinary group. I mean, a group unlike any other before or since. Not just for what they did, but also the way they went about it, being original the whole time, for example,
and also getting out. You know, I've talked about this with my friend Jeff Martin, who's here, sitting off to the side, and a huge Beatle fan like myself. But very rarely, never in show business, do people depart the stage at the perfect time. Yes. And you know, people sometimes mourn, well, if the Beatles had gone on, if the Beatles had continued, it started perfectly and it ended perfectly.
Yes.
And that adds, I think, a lot to the beauty of it all.
It ends in some pain for them.
Yes.
But it was one they were all prepared to go through.
Yeah.
I actually think, I mean, one of the people say to me, when do you think the Beatles began to break up? And I think, honestly, they began to break up the day they got together because they were never going to do it forever.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't the personalities within that group were the kind who would develop other interests and follow them. And in particular, since the Beatles were kind of formed in John Lennon's mould, he was never going to do any one thing forever. He was always going to want to move on and try something else. So I think that the Beatles came to an end at the right time. I mean, at the time itself, I was upset about it. I was disappointed. I was, you know, sorry that I wouldn't be able to buy any more Beatle records in 1970. But looking at it now as kind of hopefully more mature adult, I can see the strength of purpose that they had in order to break up. You've got the biggest act in the world who voluntarily break up because it isn't working for them anymore.
Yeah.
That is incredibly courageous.
And your last album is Abbey Road.
Yeah, and the last track on it is The End.
Yeah, if Hollywood wrote it, it would just be completely unbelievable.
Yeah.
We could talk about this for days, obviously, and we'd just be urine soaked at the end and dehydrated. So that's not going to happen.
I already am.
Yeah, I know. Trust me, I heard and detected it some 20 minutes ago. I keep thinking about Robert Caro, because Robert Caro, Lyndon Johnson used to be a caricature to me.
Yes.
And I'm very interested in American history and American presidents. And then Robert Caro wrote this amazing series of books about Lyndon Johnson that turned him from a caricature into this incredible multifaceted, and he's still going.
Yes.
And you are the Robert Caro. What Robert Caro is to Lyndon Johnson, I think you are to the Beatles. You have taken them on, and no one's going to do a better job than you at this. This is, I mean, we're all very thankful that you've taken this on. There's some concern that, how long did Volume 1 take you?
Volume 1 took 10 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how's your health? I mean, I want to see this thing through. I want you to finish this collection of books. Robert Caro said in an interview he cannot write the portion about Vietnam with Lyndon Johnson until he goes and lives in a hut in North Vietnam for a year.
Yes.
I think that's extreme. I want him to finish this, his series. Where are you in this process?
Thankfully, I'm about 30 years younger than Robert Caro.
Good, yes, yeah.
Where am I? I'm in Los Angeles to research volumes 2 and 3.
Okay.
I will go anywhere where there's something I can learn, something that I don't already know. And I'm looking for, and anyone watching this, I'm looking for any piece of paper, any document or recording or photograph that someone watching this might think I don't know. And I'm willing, obviously, to see a great deal of material that I have seen in order for the 1 in 100 that might be.
So anyone watching shouldn't edit themselves. Don't be shy. If they have something that may be of interest to you.
Something I can learn from that I can put into this history, because I don't want to hang on to anything. I'm just doing this to put it out there.
Yeah.
Because it is the most extraordinary story, the most wonderfully beautiful story of humanity, actually, I find.
Yes. That's good. I want to jump in.
It is a real human story.
I want to jump in there because I have been accused of being, because I'm such a Beatles fan and because and my friends and I, we know this music and we like to play it and we like to think about it, and I have Andy Babiak's books on the gear that they used, and
Brilliant book.
And I have the exact replica of John's Epiphone, casino that he stripped down and plays on the rooftop. He plays it on the White Album, and he plays it on Let It Be, down to the serial number recreated. And I showed that to Elvis Costello once, thinking Elvis Costello will think this is cool, and Elvis Costello looked at me and said, "That's sick." It's like, but there's oh, you're a nerd if you like this much about the Beatles. And I've always thought, I defend it. I think that doesn't sit well with me, because I think this is a story about so much more than this amazing rock band. It is, there's something that keeps pulling us back to this story because it's about something much bigger. I can't quite explain what that is, but to me, this is about so much more than this great rock band of the 60s.
They have the central story of post-war culture, I would say. They have the central story. And I'm attempting to tell not just their story, but the entire context of everything that was going on around them, because they didn't exist in a vacuum. The Beatles, they plugged into everything. And everyone plugged into them. So in order to tell their story and put them in proper context, I have to tell a much broader, deeper story. I tell the whole story of the music business, telling the whole story of rock and roll and all the other acts. Volumes 2 and 3 will cover the 60s from a deep cultural perspective, not just the Beatles. But legitimately, you can go there by telling the Beatles story. You can spread out.
It takes you to so many other places.
It takes you everywhere.
You have the story of
Absolutely
immigration.
Everywhere.
Immigration from Ireland to Liverpool. People who probably should have gone, to Boston, but didn't get there. And stayed in Liverpool. And
Ed Sullivan's family came on to New York, but the Beatles family stayed in Liverpool. It's a story that, since they did change everything, I have to demonstrate what things were like before they changed them, the world in which the Beatles appeared, and the way in which everything very rapidly revolutionizes. You look at America from 1963, the American youth, say, in 1963, and American youth in 1970. There's a phenomenal change there. Now, it isn't due entirely to the Beatles, without doubt. There's a lot of things happening, but they are the accelerants of everything. And they show everyone that there are other ways of doing things, and they're so positive and they're so original in what they do that they spark and inspire people everywhere to be original and different. And a whole cultural revolution takes place, not just because of the Beatles, but very much in their image, if you like. Other people have the opportunity to go and do whatever they want to do. So I have to tell all that story. So volumes 2 and 3 will cover only about 8 years over the 2 books, something like 63 to 70. But within that period of time, the whole world is changing, and I have to show that in proper detail. Okay. And the detail is the story. The detail is not to bog it down. The detail is to let it sing. And this story has to sing.
Well, I'll give you 6 months.
Yeah, I didn't answer your question. So I'm working on volumes 2 and 3.
No, just finish. Just keep working.
Yeah,
I've taken over an hour of your time. But I think this has been worthwhile.
Yes, when this book is held up, folks, readers, viewers,
it's my fault.
It's your fault
because I wasted your time.
Yeah.
This was a big thrill for me, and I absolutely adore this book and recommend that everyone read it. And like I say, it's about so much more than the Beatles, and you've done a great job.
Thank you, Conan.
And I'll turn to my friends quickly. Is there anything I've missed that you have a question that I've got fans here of yours who are good friends of mine who said like who and I've told them if you have a question you can ask a question.
So do you? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean you're a Herman's Hermits guy, I know.
Yeah,
you're more of a. Jeff Martin and I wrote on The Simpsons together, and would every time we would take a break from writing a Simpsons script, we would go into one of our offices and just talk about the Beatles. I think pretty much not, but unfailingly.
After this.
Yeah, I know, and we'll do that after this. That's what we'll do after this, is we will leave this hour, 10-minute long or whatever it's been interview, and we will go to a restaurant around the corner and talk about the Beatles some more.
Yeah.
And you're welcome to join us.
Thank you. I mean, that is the beauty of this subject, is that it's got so many angles of approach. I mean, you can like the Beatles for any one of thousands of different reasons.
Yeah.
And they're genuine reasons as well.
Yes.
You don't have to go looking for them.
Yeah.
When you're in a gathering of people who like the Beatles, you'll find that everyone likes something different.
Yes.
And this book is something the same. Everyone who's liked it says their favourite bit is whatever it might be, and it's never the same because they're just such interesting people. And
I'll end with restating what is most remarkable about this book is it is a thriller in a way. I know that sounds like an odd thing to say, but your approach is the correct one. This didn't have to happen. This probably shouldn't have happened. And there are many steps along the way when it easily couldn't have happened.
Yeah.
And the fact that it happened is almost like a religious experience. It's so many perfect things happen at the right time.
Yeah.
And the idea that these 4 guys from a town that no one had ever, especially in the United States, had ever even heard of, would come together. If you had told anybody in 1959 or 1960 that the biggest thing in the next decade in music is going to be 4 guys from Liverpool, England, you'd have been laughed.
If you'd said that in England, you would have been laughed.
You've been laughed out of England, yeah.
Yeah.
So I wish you the best of luck. Keep working. Tune in. Mark Lewisohn, this is volume 1. There's also an extended special edition, which I have at home. I have both. I'll lift it up. Oh, there we go. It's both. Yes, it is absolutely, I mean, it's like you're writing about Winston Churchill, but it works. It's beautiful. There's 2 volumes in there, and man, and still, this is just scratching the surface, so.
Well, it covers up to 62 pretty thoroughly, but the next few years, I mean, such a lot is happening.
Right.
I think we can expect something similar.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. This has been a real, it's been a real honor. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
That's it. That's our audience. We have 4 people clapping.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the clap.